Shefali, I welcome you and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. And Jennifer's made my work a lot easier by explaining very complicated issues in a very short amount of time. I'll share my screen. Yeah, so I don't know if you all know IATP, but IATP has been our Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy has been around since 1986. Its headquarters are in Minneapolis, and we basically started because Mark Ritchie, who was the founder, realized that the changes that were going to take place with the GATT turning into the World Trade Organization were going to have huge implications on family farms, not just in the Midwest of the United States, but also in family farms all around the world. So we started as a small NGO. We're still pretty small. We're 15 folks around in the EU and the US. But with a very global perspective. So I appreciate being part of that. We started looking at the livestock industry because we did feel like it's a really good case study to show how corporate concentration in the food sector is particularly bad in the livestock sector with the big meat and dairy companies. So we've been doing this work looking at these big meat and dairy companies, the financialization of this industry, what it's done in terms of massive expansion of meat production in China, who's invested in that, what are the impacts around the world as China imports feed, et cetera, et cetera. Those were some of our first reports. But about 4 years ago, we started uh, a series of reports called the emissions. It's called the Emissions Impossible series. We did 4 reports, and one of your staff members, Darren Qualman, actually helped us do the emissions calculations of these companies. And the idea behind that, this was our first report. It was called Emissions Impossible: How Big Meat and Dairy Are Heating Up the Planet. It was co-published with Grain, and we developed a methodology to look at the number of animals in their supply chain and the emissions that result from that, the greenhouse gas emissions. And the idea was to show that, the whole idea of corporate concentration is that you get bigger and bigger, and the farms get bigger and bigger, and a lot of the small producers have to get out of the business. And that model is not just bad for the climate, bad for the environment, but it's bad for farmers. And so that was the purpose of it. And we started that 4 years ago, and we continued with Milking the Planet, which was focused on the dairy industry, and then looking at the companies headquartered in the EU. And just recently in the climate conference, we just released this report, which is the methane edition, to look at the methane that comes out of that. And really the idea has been to show that bigger is not better, and that there's other ways of producing livestock. And so, I mean, and these companies are some of the wealthiest, right? Like this is an image from our last report, and we're talking about, you know, Dairy Farmers of America, 19.4 billion is about JBS, which is, it's the giant of the giants. It earned 65 billion euros in revenue last year, and it describes itself as the #1 global beef producer, the #1 global poultry producer, the #2 global pork producer. And last year they bought out a huge farm in Tasmania and went into aquaculture. So now it's the #2 salmon producer in Australia. And as Jennifer said, they are also in prepared foods, and now they're also in plant-based alternatives. So, and JBS, I mean, has significant market share in the US, in Canada, in Australia. It's a behemoth. And part of its success has been acquisitions. So last year alone, it acquired 7 companies, worth 12.3 billion in revenue. And another company, an example that I have is Lactalis, which is based in France, but it has a revenue of 21 billion euros in 2021 and acquired 7 companies, including 4 just in the last 5 years. So their strategy is to definitely acquire as many companies as possible in the shortest amount of time. And this concentration is also, the fact that very few companies control so much of the market share, and they're headquartered in very few countries. We've looked at the fact that 6 countries in the EU are responsible for the the lion's share of rising global meat production and exports. So when it comes to pork, China produces like 50% of the world's pork, and then followed by the EU and then the United States. And when it comes to exports, Canada has like 16% of those exports. The EU has 35%. So you can really pinpoint where the whole mass production is happening and what's driving it, both in terms of countries and companies. So in our first report, we looked at, the 35 companies, meat and dairy companies, and this still gets the headlines today, which is that, the top 5 companies emitted more greenhouse gases than Exxon or BP or Shell. And incidentally, that number has been reduced to 15 companies in the report we just launched, last week at the climate conference. So you can see that the concentration is getting bigger and bigger. You only need like a few number of companies that are doing all of this. The next report, Milking the Planet, which we did in 2020, again, the idea was to show that just 13 global dairy companies combined increased their greenhouse gases by 11% in 2 years. So we compared between the companies that we did in 2018 and then 2 years later, how much their emissions had gone up. And their emissions had gone up because they had acquired all these other companies. And we were saying, you acquire the companies, you're responsible for the emissions in the supply chain. But what we also showed, and this is a tweet from the National Farmers Union, was what was happening while all these acquisitions were taking place. Well, we were losing farms, right? In the US, we lost so many between 1997 and 2017. And that the money that the farmers were getting was also, they were getting further and further in debt. And so this is an image from our report, which shows how this growing concentration, growing power of these companies was resulting in both the US and the EU with lots of farms being lost, with farms getting bigger. And what has really happened in the last 4 years since we started publishing this stuff is that more and more companies are now coming out and saying, hey, look, we're reducing our emissions. We're going to do all this stuff in our supply chains. We have net zero targets. We have, nature-based solutions. So we've got a lot more jargon coming out just in the last few years. And many companies, Tyson, Cargill, even JBS, they're all declaring net zero targets, regardless of what they're actually doing in practice. So this presents a lot of challenges for us as civil society groups. And last year, the report that we did, which looked at the companies headquartered in the EU, but it really applies to everybody, is that we looked at 6 major ways that they're responding to, this whole idea about climate change and what are companies doing. So one thing they're doing is they're co-opting the narrative on regenerative agriculture and agroecology. They're saying, look, we're supporting our farmers. We're putting money in. Nestle with a revenue of like 96 billion is saying we're putting in 4 billion, over 5 years or something like this. So when you actually look at the numbers compared to what they're earning, you're like, okay, how does that translate in terms of the number of farmers you have in your supply chain? The second thing they say that they're doing is they're focusing on reductions of emissions per kilo of meat or liter of milk. And that's a very convenient, it's called in the climate jargon, it's called emissions intensity reduction. But what it fundamentally means is, look, we can keep getting more and more animals in our supply chain, but if we get each of those cows to pump more milk faster, better, and if we can like tweak the feed, and if we can somehow tweak the fertilizer, somehow, we can report that these emissions per liter or per kilo are less. And so therefore, that small farm over there is operating way more inefficiently than our, mass produced farms where we can control everything. Another way that they're doing this is that they're buying offsets. And the whole notion of offsets is that, hey, I'm going to buy a carbon credit somewhere else. and then say, I can compensate for my emissions through that. And they're also actually developing how to measure the emissions reductions themselves. So all of these carbon credits, they're based on life cycle analyses. They're called carbon methodologies. And Nestle and a whole bunch of other companies have come together and said, we're going to create a methodology for carbon sequestration that governments can use to credit us. Then another thing that they're doing is like trying to develop credits for methane reduction. So there's a company called Mutrol, which has this feed additive that they say works, and they're trying to sell it and try to get farmers to use it and companies who might use it, and then airline companies can then maybe buy those credits so that they feel like they're reducing their emissions even though they're emitting so much by flying. And so these are all the kinds of things. And finally, then there's biogas, right? A lot of public money is going into biogas digesters, anaerobic digesters for manure lagoons, et cetera, et cetera. There's a huge problem in the US around that. That's another major strategy that they're using. Next slide. So I won't go into this whole offset. I just briefly explain offsets. Happy to share the slide, but what's really happening now is Nestle has coined this term called insetting, which means I won't go outside of my supply chain. I won't go and say, buy credits for somebody saving the mangroves in Bangladesh or planting trees in Kenya. Me as Mars or as JBS, I'm going to invest in the farmers in my supply chain. And I'm going to get them to reduce their emissions, and I'm going to claim those credits from them, from the farmers in my supply chain. So that's now called insetting. And this is certainly where I live in Berlin in Germany. This is becoming a big deal because the EU is about to propose a law about carbon removals and wants to develop carbon methodologies for this. So companies, food and beverage companies are saying, great, but we want all the credits for our farmers to stay with us so that we can claim credits for this rather than Microsoft or Shell or somebody else, because there are farmers. Next slide. So I was explaining to you guys about emissions intensity, and this is a good image to show what this means. So the first slide is, one cow, maybe it emits 0.75 tons and you get 1 bottle of milk. And they're saying, look, but we can produce so efficiently, each cow with us produces 0.5 tons of greenhouse gases. And so we're really doing much better, but they're producing way more milk. So at the end of the day, they're emitting a lot more because the atmosphere doesn't care whether one cow emits, 1 or 2 tons of emissions. What matters is the overall emissions. And that's the whole point, that the more production we have, the more emissions we're going to have. Next slide. I think the key is that all of these things that are taking place now within this whole net zero climate targets, I understand Canada is also developing a climate law. You guys have your Alberta offset scheme already. What's happening is that a lot of the onus for the action that these companies want to take is going to be falling on the farmers and their supply chains. So this whole huge groups of corporations have come together. It's called the Cool Farm Alliance, where they've developed the Cool Farm Alliance tool, the Cool Farm tool, and they are wanting farmers to record every aspect of what they do and to submit that data to the company that they're engaged with. Next slide. So they've got this nice website. It says, use the Cool Farm tool. It's free for farmers. But the point is, there's a whole host of issues here in terms of who controls this data. What are they going to do with this data? The farmers have to do all the work and bear all the risk. and the companies take the credit. And different governments are coming up with different rules. So we really have to get smart about, what is the liability for farmers? What are the costs? Um, what is the actual income that's going to be delivered? So these are all the kinds of issues that all of this throws up. I was at the climate conference in Egypt just 2 weeks ago, and I sat in on a session with Indigo, which is a carbon aggregator, Vera, which is a certifier of carbon credits, and Mars, the company, which is number 6 in terms of the biggest sales, of the biggest food and beverage companies. And it was the most fascinating conversation and frankly terrifying, but also fascinating, because they admitted there were so many problems with this whole thing, right? How do you measure this stuff? Farmers are skeptical. Gee, I wonder why. And this issue of liability came up, because soil carbon is impermanent. You lose it. You lose it because there's a drought. You lose it because there's fire. You lose it because there's a flood. All kinds of things. Farmer might decide, hey, what I'm planting isn't going to work for me this year for various reasons. So if you get into a contract, who's liable if that carbon doesn't get stored? And Mars said, hey, you know what? I want my farmers to stay with me. I don't want Microsoft to buy credits from my farmers because, so I'm not going to poach from somebody else. I'm going to, insist that my farmers stay with me so that I, as Mars' CEO, can have those credits. But at the same time, I will expect that these farmers then permanently store this carbon because that's part of the contract. If I'm going to invest in them, then they have to permanently store it. And I just couldn't believe it, right? Because it's like, well, you can't store it permanently because that's just not possible. But these are the kinds of conversations that are taking place within the whole climate context. So I think it's a really important time for us. And it's great that you guys are together to discuss all of these things because these are the challenges that we face today. And the bottom line is bigger is not better. And corporate concentration is leading to this whole race to the bottom. And their narrative around climate change and emissions is bogus. So we need to go back to the basics and say, no, the more overproduction there is, the more emissions there are going to be. So we do need to decentralize our food systems. So with all of that, I want to leave on a positive note to say we need to continue advocating for decentralized food systems and all the issues all the key areas that Jennifer brought up are exactly the kinds of areas that we need to be doubling down on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shefali, on just kind of enlightening us further on some of these manipulations on these false solutions to climate crisis. And hopefully we as savvy farmers in the NFU and beyond in all of our networks can start to help to push to decentralize